Oh baby, you've been making me crazy. Wait, my heart has been racing. I've been feeling you lately, baby. You've been making me crazy. Wait, my heart has been racing. I've been feeling you lately, yeah. I feel alive, can I tell it like it was no surprise, that you caught my eye. Anything you want, just know I got it for you, got it for you.
Up in paradise, I suppose. If you would tell me I'm the only one that you love, life could be a dream, sweetheart. Hello, hello again. Shaboom, and off with me again. Oh, life could be a dream. If I could take you.
Freaking goodness, why is the wind so... It's only affecting me, by the way. Nobody else in here. It's nobody else. Just me.
That's
You
guys are on air. Can you stop?
Can you believe it? Like,
You guys, we're filming. We're filming.
We
started
okay.
already.
Sorry. Today, we are going to be interviewing a Egyptian, a Bantu, and a Nubian. So yeah, we're gonna get started with this, or you just want me? I really just want to get paid. Today we will be interviewing an Egyptian, a Nubian, and a Bantu. So how did Egypt start?
Well, sub-Saharan Africa used to have grassy lands and lakes and rivers. So Sudanic people herded sheep and goats and cultivated sorghum, watermelons.
Hi!
End the call.
What?
End the call.
I'm sorry.
So Sudanic people herded sheep and goats and cultivated sorghum, watermelons, and yams. Sudanic people even made small kingdoms, but climate change after 5000 BCE made northern Africa hotter and drier. So Sudanic people moved to the Nile River Valley. Every year, the Nile River would flood and leave behind very fertile land. Egypt was the land above the lower third of the Nile River, so they had more flooded lands than the Nubias, which was more south. Egyptian agricultural society was more prosperous.
Interesting. How were Egyptian and Nubian agriculture different?
Well, the Egyptians had to support a bigger population, so they had to start growing crops on higher grounds and build dikes to protect from floods. Nubians, on the other hand, just used fields and irrigation from the river.
So, tell me about politics in Egypt and Nubia.
By 4000 BCE, Egypt and Nubia had small kingdoms. By around 3500 BCE, kingdoms would have small wars because of economic and political competition.
So Tasedi was like a strong Nubian realm that extended to Egypt.
Egyptian rulers wanted to unify Egypt. About 3100, King Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt. He founded the capital of Memphis, and rulers were called pharaohs and considered gods.
What was the archaic period and Old Kingdom?
The archaic period was from 3100 to 2660 BCE. In the Old Kingdom, they built massive pyramids.
Very impressive. Super interesting.
Okay, but ask them about this.
You want to be interested in that?
Yeah.
Can do.
We'll just try at least. Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So, what was the Middle Kingdom?
The Middle Kingdom was when the pharaohs came to power again after some regions ignored them. Pharaohs were not as powerful as in the Old Kingdom, but they stabilized Egypt.
Who were the Hyksos?
Hyksos were horse-riding nomads from southwest Africa who used bronze weapons and bronze-tipped arrows. Egyptians used wooden weapons and stone arrows. Hyksos captured Memphis and ruled Egypt. In Upper Egypt, nobles organized revolts. Eventually, Hyksos were pushed out and the New Kingdom was made. The New Kingdom was prosperous and productive. There was a pharaoh, an army, and a bureaucracy that divided the government into different departments. Pharaohs took over lands that could become threats. Thutmose III had an empire that included Palestine, Syria, and Nubia. After the New Kingdom, Egypt declined and Egypt was driven out of Nubia and Southwest Asia, who then invaded Egypt.
How was the kingdom of Kush revived?
After the Egyptian forces retreated from Kush, about the 10th century BCE, the Nubian leaders made a new Kush kingdom. By the 8th century BCE, they were strong enough to invade Egypt. In 760, King Kashta conquered Thebes.
Hello.
Jocelyn. Your interview. In the middle of an interview.
I really don't care.
As I was saying, King Kashta conquered Thebes and founded a Kushite dynasty in Egypt. During the mid-7th century BCE, Assyrian armies with iron weapons invaded Egypt and drove out the Kushites.
What are the social classes in Egypt?
Egyptian peasants and slaves did hard labor. The pharaoh was the center absolute ruler. The central government included military and administrators and tax collectors.
Meroe had government officials, priests, craftsmen, merchants, and slaves. The cemeteries reflected the wealth of the people who lived there.
Men had more power, but women in the royal family would influence policies. Queen Hatshepsut ruled with her stepson.
But in Nubia, there were many female rulers, priestesses, and scribes.
Tell us about your technology.
We used bronze weapons in our armies. For transportations, we used boats and donkey caravans.
In Nubia, we made and used iron.
What was trading like?
We had specialized labor. We traded pottery, wine, and fine linen, textiles in exchange for ivory, skins, feathers, gold, and slaves from the Mediterranean and Nubia.
Did you guys have writing?
We have pictographic writing called hieroglyphics for formal writing. For everyday things, we use hieratic script. Educated people became scribes.
Nubians had our own language, but we used hieroglyphics and Egyptian influence after the 5th century BCE. Nubian scribes made a Meroitic language.
Two of the main gods were Amon, who was a sun god and a creation god. There was also Re, who was also a sun god. The cult of Amon-Re started, but when Pharaoh Akhenaten came to power, he said that Aten, another sun god, was the only god. Mummification helped the dead achieve immortality. Osiris was associated with immortality, and they made a cult for him.
Nubians had their own war god and creator god. Nubians did not mummify dead people, but they did build pyramids and honored Amon and Osiris.
Who were the Bantu?
The Bantu were languages spoken by people in West Africa. They cultivated crops and kept goats, and they lived in clan-based villages and traded pottery as well as stone axes with hunter-gatherers for meat and honey. By 3000 BCE, they started to migrate south.
So, what helped cause migration?
Population pressure likely caused the migrations. People used canoes to travel, and agricultural surpluses increased their populations fast. After 1000 BCE, iron sped up Bantu migrations by providing better weapons and agricultural tools.
What were the effects of migration?
Cultivation of yams and grains were spread throughout Africa, and herders introduced sheep and cattle. Bantu migrations mixed cultures and religions, and the people built distinctive societies as well as tradition. For example, Sudanic people had monotheistic beliefs of a single force that is good and evil. Niger-Congo people believed in one god called Nyamba who made the world.
Are we done?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Can I leave?
You have to say bye.
Really?
Yeah. It'll cut off weird if you don't.
Fine. Hi. Goodbye. Nice meeting you.
Due to early migrations by Bantu or Africans such as the Kushites, Sundanese, and Mandé to the south of the equator, agriculture and herding spread to nearly all parts of Africa. Dietary samples being yams, sorghum, and millet, playing a role in increasing population, continuing migration. Bananas too encouraged a migratory surge, coming from Southeast Asia, entering Africa by sea lanes, and eventually becoming well known across Africa by 500 CE. The Bantu, especially, whose main food source were bananas. Another significant thing were iron metallurgy. From these two, Bantu population standing at 3.5 million to 11 million, and sub-Saharan Africa at 22 million. Migration eventually became difficult, so by 1000 CE, new forms of government were created. Bantu, however, did not depend on a hierarchy. Through kinships and family groups is how they governed themselves. Males of the family decided on political affairs, prominent being the chief, who presented the new ruling. Starting as small communities, the Tiv people, for example, grew to 1 million with a kin-based society. Similar to migration, kin-based societies face challenges like high population, lack of resource, and few land. With conflict between the village and district, military forces occurred. Districts fell under chiefs who then disregarded kinship to practice their own authorities. Active political development was the Congo River, most prosperous being the Kingdom of Congo, participating in trade networks of copper, raffia cloth, and Zimbu's shells. Its central government were the kings and officials. This provided organizations in the 14th and mid-17th centuries. Now to introduction of Islamic faith to sub-Saharan Africa through land by camels and sea lanes. Islamic influenced political, social, and economic development. With camels coming from Arabia, communication and transportation quickened. By 300 CE, they replaced horses and donkeys. With Muslims' arrival, the principal state of the time was Kingdom of Ghana, who were either going to emerge or soon disappear. Luckily, Ghana went under dramatic change as it became a commercial site for gold. There were many traveling across the Sahara to Ghana for gold. Besides gold, they also traded in ivory and slaves. In return, they received horses, cloth, salt, and small manufactured goods. All of this gave massive wealth and power to Ghana. Its capital was Kumbai Saleh, with a population of 15 to 22,000. Small but a thriving commercial center with buildings of stone and moss. Al-Bakri, a Spanish Muslim traveler, described 200,000 warriors protecting gold and nomadic invasions. By the 10th century, kings of Ghana converted to Islam but did not reinforce it into their society. However, the king's conversion led to improved relations, support, and recognition by Muslim states. With this expansion to the north, Ghana suffered from attacks. The kingdom weakened by the 13th century and had fallen to Mali's empire. Sundiata, a lion prince who discovered the Mali Empire in West Africa and was also remembered through traditions of stories, histories, verbally through singers and storytellers known as griots. It was believed that Sundiata's father ruled a small kingdom, a form of royalty. Sundiata, however, still had a difficult childhood with his broken leg. Enemies invaded, killing many, unfearful of Sundiata, mainly because of his leg, and left but Sundiata eventually being powerful, claiming his throne in 1235. Ruling throughout the Niger River, Mali Empire became the wealthiest with its gold trade and political stability. Eventually, many links and networks established from East Asia and the Mediterranean basin in the classical era. Islam became most prominent during Montenu's ruling from 1324 to 1325. He was also Sundiata's great-nephew. He took his religion seriously, especially after his voyage to Mecca, building mosques and gave opportunities to Islam scholars. However, during Montenu's time, the Mali Empire would fall from factions and seceded provinces. It eventually fell in Songhai's power.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's game show. I'm your host, Michaela, and let's not forget today's sponsor, me. Follow me at... Our topic today is Africa and Atlantic World. Our contestants are Victoria, Jocelyn, and Mary. First question, who is Thomas Peters and what did he do?
He was a former slave who escaped to Nova Scotia. In 1792, he led a group of blacks to Freetown, a colony for former slaves in Sierra Leone.
10 points to Jocelyn. Second question, what was the Ghana Kingdom?
The Ghana Kingdom originated in the 4th to 5th century. Controlling and taxing gold trade, it helped Ghana have a large army and big influence in West Africa. By the 13th century, the Mali Empire replaced Ghana but still controlled the Trans-Saharan trade.
Very good. 10 points to Mary. Can someone tell me about Songhai Empire?
Well, by the 15th century, the Mali began to weaken and Songhai began to take over and raid the Mali kingdom. Sunni Ali conquered Mali and made the Songhai Empire.
10 points to Victoria. What was the Songhai administration like?
So the Sunni Ali had governors in provinces and a powerful army. This led future rulers to expand the empire. The Songhai emperors were all Muslims and used it as a foundation for culture and trade.
10 points to Jocelyn. Tell us about Songhai.
The Songhai traded gold and slaves in exchange for salt, textiles, and metal goods as well.
5 points to Mary. Tell us about the fall of Songhai.
In 1591, a Moroccan army with muskets destroyed their army, which allowed people to revolt. Small regional kingdoms rose.
5 points to Victoria. Tell us about the Swahili decline.
In 1502, Vasco da Gama forced Kilwa to pay tribute, and in 1505, Portuguese forces took control of their cities. Then trade declined.
Good. 10 points to Jocelyn. What did the Congo do?
Okay, chill.
Congo was a Central African kingdom that established trade relations with Portugal in 1483. King Alfonso I then converted to Christianity.
The Portuguese brought textiles, weapons, advisors, and artisans in exchange for copper, ivory, and slaves.
Over time, slavery helped the Portuguese undermine the power of Congo kings. In 1665, Portuguese colonists went to war with Congo and won. By the 18th century, Congo was gone.
5 points to you all. Why was Ndongo important?
Also known as Angola, Ndongo traded with Portuguese merchants. Portuguese used the colonies in Ndongo to straight the slave trade.
10 points to Victoria. Who was Queen Nzinga?
She was
The queen of Ndongo who led resistance against the Portuguese, and she wanted to drive out the Europeans and make an African empire.
10 points to Mary. Who was Queen Nzinga?
She was unable to drive out the Portuguese because they were rich and had better weapons. After her death, there was less resistance.
10 points to Victoria. Who was Khoi Khoi?
They were
hunter and gatherers. Dutch mariners encountered in Cape Town. Dutch colonies used them for labor.
10 points to Jocelyn. What do Africans believe in?
They believed in supreme gods and powerful natural nature spirits. Islam was popular.
Islam
was popular in trading cities, and it was a blend of Islam and African beliefs.
10 points to Mary. Who were the Fulani?
Originally, they were pastoral peoples who eventually settled in cities, practicing strict Islam. They led military conquest to spread Islam.
10 points to Victoria. Next question. What was Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa like?
Go.
Portuguese brought Roman Catholic Christianity to Central Africa. It was blended with African traditions as well.
5 points to Mary. What was the Antonian movement?
It began in 1704 when Dona Beatriz claimed the patron saint of Portugal possessed her to give his messages. She promoted an African form of Christianity but was executed. In 1708, thousands of her followers challenged the king of Congo.
10 points to Jocelyn. What were the new foods brought to Africa from trade?
Portuguese ships brought manioc, maize, and peanuts. Bread from the manioc flour helped the population grow. In 1500 CE, the population of sub-Saharan Africa was 34 million. In 1800, it was 60 million.
10 points to Victoria. What was slavery like in Africa?
Slaves in Africa were usually war captains and criminals. They were used for labor and working jobs. Slaves were a measure of wealth and were even freed.
10 points to Victoria. What was the Islamic trade?
Muslim merchants would buy and sell African slaves. They would raid villages for more slaves. About 10 million slaves were taken.
The Europeans used existing slave trade networks and expanded them. In 1441, the Portuguese took 12 Africans to Portugal as slaves, and then the numbers grew as they needed more labor on the sugar plantations or mines.
10 points to Jocelyn and 10 points to Mary. Why did the Spanish use African slaves?
Diseases killed a lot of indigenous people in the Caribbean and the Americas. So they used African slaves for labor in sugar plantations. By the early 17th century, though, the English brought slaves to North America.
10 points to Mary. What was the triangular trade?
Europeans would first bring horses, cloth, and weapons to Africa in exchange for slaves. Then they would take slaves across the Atlantic to plantations in exchange for money, sugar, or molasses. They then would bring American goods back to Europe. It was very profitable.
10 points to Victoria. What were the consequences of triangular trade?
Millions of Africans were taken from their homes and sent across the Middle Passage. Conditions in ships were very filthy and cramped. That slaves would try to starve themselves to death or mount revolts. Many would die along the way due to heat, cold, and disease.
Also, 12 million Africans were enslaved in total, and the peak was in the 18th century. Africa lost labor and had their sex ratios distorted. Slavery also led to more violence from slave raiders.
10 points to Jocelyn and 10 points to Mary. What was the life in plantations like as a slave?
African slaves were sent to work in plantations mostly in the Caribbean and Americas that produced sugar, tobacco, indigo, cotton, and coffee. Many slaves caught diseases and had malnutrition.
10 points to Mary. Was there any resistance to slavery?
Yes. Some slaves would work solely for the owners and mess up equipment. Some would even run away. Runaways were called maroons, and they would build their own communities.
Also, slave owners feared slave revolts because they were outnumbered. But revolts never ended slavery. Only in Saint Domingue, the slaves were able to free themselves and create a Haiti.
5 points to Victoria. How is African culture affected by slave trade?
African slaves would speak a Creole language made from several African and European languages.
Also, slaves introduced African foods to make hybrid cuisines. They introduced rice cultivation and influenced how people lived.
To add on that, Africans would convert to Christianity and syncret faiths from African traditions.
3 points to Mary, Jocelyn, and Victoria. Who was Olaudah Equiano?
He was a former slave who published books about being a slave. He gave anti-slavery speeches and strengthened the movement in England.
100 points to Jocelyn. What were the economic causes that led to the end of slavery?
Keeping slaves was not cheap. There had to be militaries in case of rebellions, and owners had to take care of them. Prices of sugar went down, and Europeans invested in factories more, which was more profitable to them.
10 points to Victoria. When did slavery end?
European countries and the United States abolished slave trade legally in the early 1800s. Slaves were later emancipated, first in British colonies in 1833, and 1865 for the U.S.
10 points to Mary. Time to count up the points. Jocelyn got 130 points. Congrats.
Yes, I won. Ha! In your face, Mary.
Oh. It looks like Mary actually won.
See, told you.
Sorry, how many points did I get?
130.
How many points did she get?
It added up to 500 points. Congrats!
Hey, Victoria, back me up. I swear, like, really?